My name is Grace. I use she and her pronouns. I am MCASA's Sexual Assault Response Team and Prison Rape Elimination Act Policy Specialist. I'm so excited to be here with you today. We are going to be focusing on hospital-based advocacy and intervention for the next hour and a half. But before we get going, I want to name that there is excellent and invaluable professional and lived experience in this space, in this training. Please feel free to participate in a way that is meaningful to you, whether that's leaving questions, comments, chatting with your fellow participants, engaging me. But I also want to note that there are definitely and certainly survivors in this space. So please take the time to take care of yourself, whatever that looks like for you. I am not going to be providing trigger warnings slide to slide or throughout the presentation, but we will be discussing sexual assault forensic exams in detail. If that is challenging for you, regardless of your identity, please feel free to opt in and opt out of this training as it's helpful for you. As Alyssa mentioned, we will be recording it, so if something feels like it's too much right now, you can always come back to it later. Moving on from there, just our objectives for today. We're going to review the importance and the role of advocacy during the sexual assault forensic exam. I want to provide space to contextualize trauma-informed care and the Power With framework within the hospital and exam setting. Next, we'll examine various parts of the exam itself and best practices when supporting survivors. Lastly, I would really love your participation in any and all, but especially the last section of this training. We're going to brainstorm and work together to address immediate and ongoing self-care strategies for advocates in an effort to avoid compassion fatigue, burnout, and vicarious trauma. So I'm going to throw this out to the group because I'm really interested in your perception, your answer to this question. So what do you think the role of an advocate is? So in a hospital setting, what is the role of a sexual assault advocate? Feel free to type in the chat as it's helpful, and or just listen to your fellow participants' responses. Provide options, ensure informed consent, safety planning, resourcing, assessing, providing support, to provide accompaniment and advocacy and inform the clients of their rights, be support in any way possible, but you are not a best friend or therapist. Yep. Providing support, resources, explaining rights, etc. Excellent. Thank you all. So I always view all of these are great answers. An advocate is an independent support person. Wendy said safety planning, yep, to ensure and work towards ensuring that survivors feel heard and that they're taken seriously and that their rights are respected. Advocates also work to assist people in accessing appropriate care, understanding information, services, and their options. Fundamentally, I view advocacy as a helping and healing relationship. It is a survivor-led relationship grounded in equity with a fundamental respect for survivor choice and autonomy. I often describe my work as an advocate as someone who is working to hold and create space for survivors. My goal is that space is a safe one. It's a survivor-led space, and I support that facilitation. I've also heard other professionals use the analogy of like a driver and a passenger. The survivor is the driver, the advocate is the passenger. So the survivor leads the way, leads the interaction, and the advocate is the passenger, supports, facilitates, offers options. So I researched this question pretty specifically, but if you all, again, wouldn't mind participating, what are the benefits of having an advocate present during a medical forensic exam or even working with law enforcement? Because we know often those two things co occur or happen really within quite a short span of time. Not always, but sometimes. So, what are the benefits of having an advocate present for survivors? Emotional support, a compassionate handholder, able to advocate for clients' rights. Yeah. Letting them know they're not alone. Yeah, that's a big one. We know sexual violence is so isolating. Having an advocate with you can be invaluable in that. Support, someone who can help with communication when the client feels stuck. Excellent. Reassurance. So these are all great. Safe support and presence, liaison to help create shared understanding. Sorry, Wendy, create shared understanding. When I was preparing for this training, I actually did some specific research around the benefits of advocacy, and I'm happy to share with this research with you all later. But while research is somewhat limited, the consistent conclusion is that advocacy services facilitate the recovery of sexual assault survivors and increase access to other systems of support, including, but not obviously required, the criminal justice system. So, one statewide study of rape crisis centers found that survivors rated advocates as supportive and informative, so pretty general. But another found that victims who work with an advocate experience less distress after contacting legal and medical systems. A third indicated that victims were more likely to have a police report taken when an advocate was present. So 59% had an advocate present versus 41%, and their case was more likely to be investigated by police. With respect to medical services, victims are more likely to receive information on STDs and STIs, 72 versus 36, and HIV and prophylactic treatment for STDs and STIs. So 86 versus 56% of survivors. That's 86% do receive that treatment when an advocate is present, and 56 do when an advocate is not. Victims are less likely to be treated as impersonally or cold, according to this research study. And medical professionals were also less likely to refuse to conduct the exam because the assault occurred too long ago, or medical professionals did not believe that the assault occurred. Found this data really interesting to sort of highlight the ways in which advocates serve a really important role in supporting survivors if they would like to engage in the medical and criminal justice system. So moving on sort of from the benefits of advocacy and the importance of advocacy to contextualizing trauma-informed care. I think it's helpful to ground this training in hospital work in two frameworks. First, trauma-informed care. I know, I'm assuming rather, that we are all familiar with the concept of trauma-informed care, especially if you've gone through MCASA's victim advocate training. But the forensic exam setting is really a place where trauma-informed care can come to life. We're all familiar with the 6 principles, but these principles can and should inform practice and actions in the hospital setting. I'm going to highlight specific examples throughout this training to show where these individual values may play out in real time. When we think about sexual assault forensic exams, we are typically operating within a medical model or a medical setting, specifically a hospital or an emergency department. Unfortunately, we know that this environment is not always ideal for those who have experienced sexual assault. At its best, and when we are doing our best work, hospital advocates help survivors navigate this setting and support them in making choices and decisions that are well informed and support their health and healing. Hospital advocacy can be an important first step in a survivor's healing journey. You might be the first person that a survivor has disclosed to. Again, thinking about situating these values in context throughout this training. I'm going to highlight where these principles may be demonstrated in real time when working with survivors. So next, I think the power over to the power with framework is a really helpful one when thinking about advocacy in a hospital setting. When we think about sexual violence and sexual assault, we know in order to fully understand it, we must at least in part examine it through a power and control framework. Those who have experienced sexual violence have experienced a power over model, meaning that the perpetrator asserted power and control over another person's body. When we think about hospital advocacy at its best, we think about a power with and power within model, one in which providers or advocates collaborate with survivors to ensure that they're getting access to the care that they want and they need, not one that we perceive as necessary for them. Rather than domination, power, and control, power works with survivors to make choices that are best for them. In operating within this framework, it's really important to understand that advocates and service providers generally, there is an inherent power dynamic that exists between survivors and providers. And so how do we as providers seek to level that to one that's more equitable, right? Advocates frequently have access to resources and referrals that survivors otherwise wouldn't know about. So we as advocates have to work towards flipping that relationship to one that's power with or power within. When thinking about hospital advocacy, it can be helpful to think about forensic exams as a menu of options, so all equally available to survivors, and that hospital advocates were not there to tell survivors what to do. Rather, we are there to help support the possibilities and the choices that survivors want to make. Often we are translating a confusing and potentially invasive medical exam to hopefully a space where survivors are encouraged and empowered to make their own decisions. I always try to view the exam space and advocacy as a place where survivors can start to take back some of that power and control. We can help facilitate and support that. Now, that all sounds very hypothetical, but how do we do that in real time? So moving to the exam itself, so going through the exam process. Before someone enters the hospital, rather once they arrive at the hospital for a forensic exam, survivors have to be medically cleared to receive an exam, meaning that they have to be able to consent to the exam, and a physician or another provider has to determine that they are medically well enough for the exam to take place. So typically, they're triaged through the emergency department. This triage process can take a lot longer than you might think. Survivors are coming to you before the exam and trying to make a decision around if they should get an exam or if they would like medical care in another setting. It's really important to be honest about the length of the exam and the length of the time that you might be in the hospital. So again, we don't want to make promises that we can't keep. That transparency piece of trauma-informed care is really important here. So not only do they have to be triaged through the emergency department, which can take some time, but the exam typically lasts anywhere from 2 to 6 hours. Now, while waiting for the exam, advocates and survivors can work together to address other needs, but we really want to think about the timeline of the exam and making sure that that timeline is reasonable for survivors. I know some survivors that I've worked with in the past have had childcare issues, so they've had to wait to get an exam to ensure that they could have access to childcare. So really allowing them to enter this space in the hospital on their own terms, if and when they are ready. A lot of times I always joke that sort of a hurry up and wait situation. So you get to the hospital, there's a lot of anxiety typically about getting the exam started, and it takes so much more time than you think it does for it to actually begin, and helping survivors navigate that waiting time. So once we meet a survivor, how do you introduce yourself? This can be a surprisingly difficult part of supporting a survivor through a forensic exam. So, how are you introducing yourself? Um, what are you saying about yourself? So, when I introduce myself, I will give my first name, not my last name. I will always introduce my pronouns, and then I will start to explain my role in this space. Um, I know there can be a lot of sort of adrenaline or anxiety about introducing yourself to a survivor, but really thinking about slowing it down for them, slowing it down for yourself. Um, from there, how do you explain your role to survivors? So, I'm an advocate. What does that mean to someone, especially someone who's gone through something deeply traumatic? So, can you succinctly, clearly explain your role to someone who might not have any idea about your profession, about this process? So, through the introduction period, I would really, really encourage everyone, this is part of that transparency piece, to pretty quickly in the interaction explain your reporting requirements. So, if you are a mandated reporter in the state of Maryland, explaining that to a survivor, what that means, and then being able to answer questions about that. So I typically keep this relatively simple. I will say, I just want to let you know before we get going together, I am a mandated reporter. So if you tell me that you are going to hurt yourself with a plan, children or other vulnerable adults are going to be hurt, I would have to report that. And then I make sure that the survivor understands and I answer any questions about that. We always want to be really clear in our reporting requirements so that um, survivors feel comfortable and they're opting into what they're sharing with us. You'll see sometimes if that's not part of your introduction and a survivor tells you something that you then have to go and make a mandated report on, it is incredibly difficult to backtrack and have to explain, like, hey, now I have to go and make a mandated report. That can be deeply re-traumatizing and traumatic for survivors. So we want to make that clear on the outset. And then from that initial interaction, we want to start building rapport with survivors. So this can be done in a few ways, but we want to start doing that quickly through the interaction. So introducing ourselves again in a way that they understand, offering space for questions about our role, about our person, and then being able to answer those clearly and succinctly. So typically after I do that, I will circle back with survivors and ask, do you have any questions about my role? What are your main concerns right now? Do you need anything? And then how can I best advocate for you in this moment? So I start to begin the triage process and prioritize their needs based on what they're saying to me. If they don't have any idea about what they need, that's okay too. So moving on from here, once you've introduced yourself and a survivor decides that they would like you to be there with them, we want to start to prioritize and address those needs. So, meeting basic comfort needs. One of the first tangible action steps in advocacy, meeting those needs. So, first and foremost, this may sound obvious, but I think it's important. Hospitals are typically freezing, and survivors who have just experienced trauma may have difficulty regulating, one, their central nervous system, but as a consequence, their temperature. So providing survivors with blankets, most emergency departments should have them. And then if there's something warm for them to hold in their hands, that can be helpful as well. Next, you of course want to ask the forensic nursing team first, but Survivors can use the restroom. This is a space where they might need to collect urine, but ensuring that they're comfortable in doing that. They know where the restrooms are if they need to go, um, making sure that they're not waiting. So maybe prompting some of that urine collection process. Again, working with the FNE to ensure timelines are appropriate. Um, Survivors may come to the hospital hungry or thirsty. Most hospitals have some sort of food available in the emergency department or within their programming, even if it's just snacks. I've seen hospitals with sandwiches, crisps, fruit, working with a forensic nurse so that we're not, denigrating evidence, but also meeting the survivor's needs. And then lastly, survivors might need hygiene products in that moment. So, whether that's menstruation products, I've seen survivors who didn't want a forensic exam, they wanted medical care, so they were seeking wipes. Now, I would not recommend that for every survivor. Again, you want to be careful of that evidence collection piece, but trying to make them as or support them in helping them get as comfortable as possible. So, once we've met some of those comfort needs, those immediate safety concerns, how are we going to explain and prepare a survivor for the forensic exam? This may seem obvious to you if you worked in this field, but you really want to avoid speaking in acronyms to survivors. So, avoiding things like FNEs or SAFEs or sakes. We want to say the actual words so that they understand what we're saying to them. I'm trying really hard to model that with you all now and not speak in acronyms, but it's just not trauma informed because survivors might not know what that acronym means. And that can be really isolating, having to ask or maybe not being able to ask what certain things mean. So avoiding those jargons and then using reflective language back to them. So the job of an advocate in part is to translate a very confusing process into something that survivors can understand in the moment. So from there, once you've connected with the survivor with the hospital, you want to explain the exam itself. So explain who can be in the room. That's different hospital to hospital. So typically that's the nurse, the advocate, the survivor. And remember, present those as options. I speak more often in passive voice when I'm working with survivors. So it can be, it may be, rather than absolutes. You want to present the exam as a menu of options. So talking through the order of the exam, what happens first, then this, and really explaining all of the exam as optional, not required. So I slow it down and I break it down really simply. First, we'll bring you back to the space where the forensic exam occurs. Then you'll get an opportunity to meet the forensic nurse. She's going to ask you, or they are going to ask you, basic questions about your medical history that you would get at the doctor. It's okay if you don't know the answers to those or you don't want to answer those questions. Then I'll prepare the survivor by saying the nurse is going to ask you for a narrative of the event. You can share as much or as little as you feel comfortable with sharing. If we ask you anything that makes you uncomfortable, you don't have to answer. I typically prep them to make sure that they know that the the forensic nurse is going to ask about what happened during the assault and make assessments from there. The next part of the exam is the nurse talking through any medication that might be available to the survivor. From there, survivor has an option to get evidence collected and a head-to-toe exam. That includes swabbing and forensic evidence collection, along with potential photography. Finally, the exam portion will be done, and then the hospital will administer your medication. So I really try and keep it small and palpable and not overwhelm them. And if I find that survivors kind of a little bit lost, or I'm giving too much information or explaining in a way that is overstimulating to them, I stop. Sometimes when we're going through something traumatic, our brain can't process in chronological order. So giving them the space and time to really understand what's going to happen before it even happens is really important. Again, the forensic nurse will also explain this to them once the exam begins, but it can be really beneficial to prepare them for going into the room and going through those questions. Additionally, making it clear, unless you work for a hospital system, that you as an advocate do not work for the forensic nursing team and you do not work for law enforcement. Sometimes survivors will think that you work for the forensic nurse or you work for law enforcement, and making it clear that your primary role in the exam is to support them. So thinking about the exam space, the physical environment where the exam takes place, some hospitals in Maryland have different policies on this, but survivors may bring support people with them to the hospital. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be allowed in the exam room. I want to name that you are there for the survivor. You are not there to advocate on behalf of the support person, so that third party. I also would like to name that we don't have a lot of context into that third party or that support person. So they may be an incredibly helpful and supportive person in the survivor's life who helps them work towards safety and healing. But on the other side of the spectrum, I've also encountered perpetrators and traffickers at the hospital. So we can't make assumptions about the safety of a third party. It's important to remember that you work with and for the survivor, not their third party. Finally, you want to make that clear. So really explaining that to them. This is especially important if you can't read the dynamic or you find the dynamic a bit tenuous or tense with the third party. Also thinking about that confidentiality piece. Your confidentiality may only apply with the survivor, not the third party. Finally, even if an interaction with the survivor and their support person is seemingly positive, as advocates, we only know what's in front of us and what's being told to us. We might not know the history of their relationship, their dynamic outside of this space. So a seemingly positive one in front of you may not always be positive or supportive. So working with an interpreter, if you feel comfortable, have you all found any best practices when working with an interpreter? You're welcome to put that in the chat if you feel comfortable sharing. What have you found that works well when working with an interpreter? Asking the client through the interpreter if they would prefer if the camera is towards them or away. Excellent. Yeah, Caitlin, that's awesome. Sometimes that interpreter adds more of a presence to the room than you might expect. Also, for privacy reasons, asking the survivor how they prefer to interface with the interpreter is really, really helpful. All right, so I will run through some here if that's helpful to you all. You want to think about introducing yourself to the interpreter and explaining your role. This may sound obvious, but the interpreter is another person in the room. Explaining who you are, your role to the interpreter, and then ensuring that the advocate, the survivor, has introduced themselves to the interpreter as well, can be really helpful. Again, you want to avoid those jargons and acronyms. So interpreters might not know what that jargon means or what that acronym stands for. So it slows down the process if they have to ask you, like, hey, what does this mean? This may sound really obvious, but you want to speak and look directly to the survivor, not the interpreter. So you are speaking through the interpreter, but you want to look at the survivor directly. This, again, you want to avoid multiple people speaking at once. So especially some of those side conversations that happen in the emergency department, that can make interpretation really challenging for the provider, and really confusing because they can't always translate who is speaking and saying what when. So really being intentional in when you are speaking and when you are holding space for silence. Use a normal tone. You don't need to yell. Like, make sure you can be heard, but speak normally, just like you regularly would. And then really obvious, but really important, do not say things that you do not want interpreted. So if you are working with law enforcement, or if you are working with a forensic nurse and you need to have a private conversation, maybe a conversation unrelated to the exam itself, just working through logistics, and you don't want that information shared with the survivor, don't say it in front of the interpreter. Be really, really clear about when you're speaking to the interpreter, when you're speaking to the survivor, and when they don't need to interpret. Adding especially video remote interpretation can be really overstimulating. So thinking about how to mitigate some of that, speaking intentionally. So we've kind of gone through some of the pieces of what happens before the exam, but how are you navigating the exam itself as an advocate? I want to highlight a few key areas that are really worth thinking about before the exam starts, so that you have an idea of how to prepare. I do want to name that you want to think about consent in this space as ongoing and informed, and reminding that to the survivor. So just because they consented to something at the beginning of the exam doesn't mean that they can't revoke that consent halfway through. So first and foremost, how are you navigating the physical space? So where is your body in the room? Are you sat next to the survivor? Are you sat across? Thinking about, are there any barriers in the room that make it either inaccessible or present sort of an emotional barrier? So if you're sitting across a desk from a survivor versus sitting next to them, that dynamic is going to be very different. And then thinking about how you're presenting physically. So we don't want to be domineering in the space. We also don't want to get in the way, especially of the forensic nurse when they're trying to do their job. So I found it helpful, especially if you're a newer advocate, to tour the exam room before you work with the survivor. So it's not new to you. You know what's coming. I also explain the physical space to the survivor before we even get in the room, so they know what to look for. Next, a small one, but an important one. Survivors, I always say to them, if you want to use your cell phone as a distraction during this exam, 100% do what you need to do to take care of yourself and make this manageable. Now, my personal use of cell phone and the forensic nurse's use of cell phones during the exam has to look a little bit different. Unfortunately, the reality of being on call means for most advocates that their phone has to be on because they might have to answer another call. I say that to the survivor before the exam starts. So I will say, I just want to let you know, I have to have my cell phone on. You have my full attention. If you hear my cell phone ringing or texting, it's not anything personal or that I'm not paying attention to you. It's that I'm on call and I might have to answer that as well, so that they know if you do have to use your phone, that you're not ignoring them. Typically, that's true of most forensic nurses as well. They'll be on call around the same time. Thinking about privacy. So more than likely, at some point, the survivor will be offered a head-to-toe physical exam. That can include the process of undressing. They're usually offered a gown, and that can also include a gynecological exam. Um, and not all survivors are comfortable having you in the space. So I always ask, do you want me in the exam room with you? I do not have to be there. And then when we get to the part of the exam where the survivor might be unclothed, before that happens, I ask again, I want to respect your privacy. Would you like me to stay with you through this portion of the exam? If they say yes, I stay, but if not, I leave. So thinking here in the narrative portion of the exam, so before um, any sort of evidence swapping may take place, the forensic nurse will ask those basic, medical questions. But if a survivor sits at a cross section of domestic violence and sexual violence, they may encounter an LAP assessment or a lethality assessment. So in most jurisdictions, it's usually the nurse, not the advocate, conducting the LAP assessment. But how are we using LAP assessments to empower survivors? Your agency will be guiding and advising you if you're part of Maryland's LAP project. But just so everyone's on the same page around what that is, it's a multi-pronged strategy to prevent domestic violence homicides. Law enforcement officers or other community professionals trained in LAP use the evidence-based assessment to identify victims of intimate partner violence and sexual violence who are at the highest risk of being killed or injured by their intimate partners. So typically you'll see that respond piece initially. So the initial assessment happens by a trained first responder, usually the nurse, who will then assess the victim's situation. If the first responder believes that the victim is in danger, they will continue to ask a series of 11 evidence-based questions. These questions are known as the lethality screening. These questions are pretty simple, but I always give survivors a heads up that they're going to be asked these questions. Typically, they ask about strangulation, if there was a weapon involved. These can be really, really triggering for survivors. So ensuring that survivors know they don't have to answer if they don't want to, but also safety planning with survivors around even just the assessment portion. So next, that first responder is going to assess. The victim's responses to the questions indicate a risk of homicide according to the scoring mechanism. The first responder usually has to inform the victim that there's a real concern for their safety, and that in situations like this, people have been killed. That can be really difficult, obviously, for survivors to hear in real time. I have seen survivors really spiral when they hear that information. So then that's typically where an advocate is called. You would be that advocate. Again, how that's the connection piece where you come in and support them through that process. But an LAP assessment is typically an empowerment-based model. So really prepping them for what those questions might look like and the assessment piece. Even if you're not the provider conducting the assessment, you will more than likely serve as the advocate. So that connect piece. We really want to think about how to translate some of that more difficult language for survivors. Really being mindful of the correct use of language. If you would like more information on LAP assessments, we are happy to connect you to MNADV, the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence, and they can answer any of those questions specifically. I do want to let you know, if you're working with sexual violence and domestic violence survivors, if they sit at that cross section, usually an LAP assessment is done. You might also see human trafficking questions at the time of the exam. Safe programs who ask these questions are using it as a screening assessment. They can vary. There are different types of human trafficking screening questions. But before the forensic nurse even begins the exam, I will let a survivor know you are going to be asked questions around human trafficking and domestic violence. If you do not feel comfortable answering these questions, you do not have to. For a lot of survivors who are not experiencing human trafficking, these questions may sound really odd to them, or like they don't, this is not their lived experience, so they don't know how to answer. But ones you might see is, can you leave a job or situation that you want to leave? Can you come and go from your place of work or where you live as you please? Have you ever been threatened if you try? Have you ever been physically harmed in any way at your home or at your place of work? They might ask what your living or working conditions are like. If anyone has threatened you or your family. And then usually they will ask if the survivor has access to their ID or documentation, whether that's travel documentation, any other sort of identification card. I always give the heads up before these questions are even asked. For human trafficking survivors, it might not be safe to leave their trafficker, and having this assessment done can be very, very triggering for them. So from the narrative portion, the assessment pieces that I just laid out, the forensic nurse is typically going to then provide options for what the exam can look like. That includes STI prophylaxis medication. That includes a head-to-toe physical exam, swabbing, and or forensic evidence photography. When a survivor says no at any part of the interaction, but especially during the exam, I always affirm that that is their choice, and I am going to be supportive in that. No does not mean maybe. It doesn't mean ask me later. No means no, full stop. Survivors can and should be able to say no to any and all of the exam at any time. I will articulate it as simply and succinctly as that to someone I'm working with. Saying no to any part of the exam is not necessarily or at all a bad sign. In fact, I use that as a sign of a healthy encounter where a survivor is encouraged to make choices that work for them. If the survivor feels safe enough to say no, they're starting to assert some of that power and control back. I think that is a good sign of, or an indication that you might be having, a positive rapport, and that the survivor is in the driver's seat. This may sound really obvious to highlight, but when a survivor says no to a particular part of the exam or referral, it's not time to convince them of otherwise. It's time to support them in that choice. Additionally, some survivors may think they want swabbing at the beginning of the exam, and then they get to the swabbing portion and it no longer serves them, or it's no longer right for them. Empower them in that no when they decide to say it. So thinking about that consistent, informed consent piece. So once you get to the physical exam part of the forensic exam, we'll typically work with a forensic nurse if the survivor would like you in the room. And survivors report to the hospital in a variety of physical conditions. You may work with survivors who are severely physically injured or have no visible signs of injury. If you're not used to working with survivors or people who have had physical injuries, it can be challenging, and I want to name that. I say this not to scare you in any way, rather to let you know that you might see this. And I always think about the following questions before I get into the hospital. First, are you prepared to support someone with maybe no signs of injury, right? Plenty of survivors come to the hospital with no signs of injury. Um, are you prepared to support someone who has very visible signs of injury? So things like bruising, burns, scrapes, scratches. Are you prepared to navigate supporting a survivor who's had injuries to their face and to their eyes? How are you going to navigate, this is a human interaction. How are you going to navigate, looking and engaging with them? Physical injuries can be really jarring and really challenging, and that's okay. But thinking about your own regulation. And then next, are there injuries that you find especially difficult to navigate? So if you're somebody who's queasy, so I will share, I really don't like looking when people are getting their blood drawn. So how do you navigate that? Are there injuries that you just find difficult to see? How are you going to regulate yourself in that space? And then I never had to do this before I started this work, but it can be really challenging to support someone who's in severe physical pain from their injury. So thinking about bringing in some of those grounding strategies to help navigate pain management and advocating for survivors when they do want pain management. So in that exam, you might see, again, a spectrum of injury, and working with the nurse to help support the survivor in that swabbing, in that documentation, and then just navigating, being in physical pain with survivors. After the exam, typically survivors are offered, if they would like, STI and HIV prophylaxis medication, pregnancy prevention, and pain management. Really important to reiterate to survivors that this is on their terms. And not every medication will be offered to survivors in every case, depending on the narrative of events that survivors provided. As an advocate, you're expected to work with survivors through the medical care process, including getting shots, getting blood drawn, and then potential imaging. You'll see on the slide, a lot of survivors might need CTs or x-rays. You might be required or invited to sit with them through that process. If survivors are interested in HIV and prophylaxis medication, I find it helpful to start that discussion early. Usually they'll have to have blood work done to ensure that their liver is functioning well enough to receive that medication. So that starting that conversation early helps move the process along so that that blood work can be done before the exam or at the end of the exam, can be tested to ensure that the survivor is receiving their medication quickly. This is really where you can work with the nurse to help support and get the process going. You'll also see survivors, this portion of the interaction, potentially realize the long-term implications of what has happened. Usually medications administered at the end of the exam, but you'll see survivors who have to take things like Plan B or PrEP realize the intensity and the severity of the experience. So preparing them for that. Additionally, if a survivor receives ceftriaxone, which is a treatment for STIs, that's typically administered through a shot. That shot is more painful than like your typical vaccine. So prepping them and letting them know that that shot, don't scare them, is going to be uncomfortable. I have found that sometimes this is really where people start who weren't previously anxious to get anxious. So being ready to help navigate that anxiety. But working with the nurse to sort of streamline these processes. The survivor isn't ready to talk about STI treatment and testing or pregnancy prevention. That is absolutely fine. You can also make referrals out if that's more helpful. So transitioning toward the end of the exam, I want to know from you all, if you are working with survivors, what are you providing to them at the hospital? I always find this really interesting. Different programs have different supplies or things that they give out. What have you all given to survivors? All right. I'm hoping that you are giving something to survivors. Hope. Thanks, Shanna. We provide care packages with underwear, socks, sweatpants, sweatshirts, and resources. Nice. Thanks, Caitlin. So Caitlin highlighted some clothing items. Really important that if a survivor chooses to surrender their clothes, it is good to have a replacement on hand. Not all emergency departments will give them clothes. Working with the nursing team to make sure that they do have access to clothing. So you might consider having some of the following. Underwear. With underwear, having pants or underwear for all genders in more than one style and more than one size. So not just giving survivors stereotypically femme underwear, right? We know male survivors come in for exams as well. People have different preferences around what they like. So making sure that we have a range of those products, socks and underwear, socks and shoes rather. So thinking about, I know this is really small, but socks that do not have grips. So the hospital usually provides grippy socks. There is a lot of stigma around those sort of grippy hospital socks. So giving them a different option I found is really helpful, especially for a survivor who's had engagement with the system before or has any sort of psychiatric history. They might have a stronger reaction to those grip socks than you expect. Regardless of age, we want to have a variety of sizes on hand for our clothes. And I generally shoot for seasonally appropriate, weather appropriate. And I always typically stick with gender neutral clothes. You might also consider having things like menstruation products, soaps and lotions, body wipes. Survivor has swabs done. They might want to sort of like clean or wash themselves off. I always have oral hygiene products with me as well. And then a small but important one, I always bring a folder with me. Survivors leave the exam with an insane amount of paperwork, the discharge paperwork, your paperwork, whatever else, and just making sure that they have, something to hold that with. So just quickly, if you went through our victim advocate training, you know this, but we never pay for exams. There is a reimbursement process through the hospital. I will say this again, advocates should not be paying for exams, full stop. There's, not only is it unnecessary, it is also a shift in the power dynamic from provider to survivor when we pay for exams. So really allowing the nurse to work through that reimbursement process. If you're working with a survivor, for example, an incarcerated survivor, ensuring that you have a release of information signed, that it is time limited and available so that you can follow up with them after the exam if they'd like to. And then having those referrals ready to go with follow-up care. So I always offer with survivors to safety plan. Make sure when you're safety planning with survivors that you know it's not a requirement, that they know it's not a requirement. Safety planning can happen at any time during the exam process, but I always mention it at the end. I will ask, do you feel safe going home? If a survivor is transitioning home and out of the advocacy phase, it's important to frame safety planning as risk management. We can't ensure safety, and safety means different things to different people. We want to think about emotional, physical, and mental safety in the aftermath of sexual violence. So I always start this process with a few quick key questions. So I'll ask survivors, what is your main concern or worry right now? I will ask, do you know of any safety risks? Then I will ask, what have you already done that's worked in the past to stay safe? What do you think is helpful to you right now? I'll also, from there, depending on their response, think about and offer resources. Preventing resources as an option, not requirement. Utilizing both internal resources, so those coping skills that we talk about, and then also external, so maybe hotlines, maybe friends, family members that they can call. So meeting them where they are in that safety planning. This is really where we want to be careful, though, about appropriately timing our interaction and our referrals. We don't want to overload people. You know, they've just gone through something traumatic. We want to create an actionable safety plan that is reasonable. I always find it helpful to provide a specific time when I am going to reach out to the survivor so that they know and have consented to that interaction in the future. You might provide things like suicide hotlines, rape crisis center hotlines, but creating tangible, small next steps. So I always say, for example, if you're comfortable with it and it feels safe, I am going to call you at X time on X day from this phone number. If you need something before then, you can reach out to the hotline, but I am planning on calling you at this time. So really thinking about how to make this tangible, actionable, and doable for survivors. So finally, transitioning out of this, this section of the presentation, this can be a really difficult one for advocates, but I think it's important to remember that we are all human beings doing this work. It's inevitable that you're going to make a mistake. We are human beings. It is part of doing this work. But where do you go when you make a mistake? How do you pick up when things fall flat? Maybe you said something that didn't land as you intended it to land, and that might not have been your intention, but it was your impact. So what do you do when you make that mistake? I always say to the advocates that I train, first and foremost, apologizing sincerely can be really, really powerful. A well-delivered apology that is sincere, that doesn't make it about you, that owns your impact, is really powerful. You might be the only provider that's ever apologized to them. And that can really help build back some of that rapport that you might have lost. Again, remembering in the space that we all make mistakes. It can be really easy to spiral when you make a mistake. So showing up as yourself, giving yourself the same grace and patience that you would a survivor, and then asking for help when you need it. Recognizing that we have to own both our intent and our impact, even if it's unintended. So Please, if you're new to this work, know that mistakes happen, and we can pick up from there in actionable ways. Before we move on to our last section about self-care, for folks who are working in safe programs with a large volume of survivors, the meme is somewhat a joke, but it does sometimes reflect my internal monologue. What do you do when you have more than one survivor to support at the hospital, but you're the only advocate? If you feel comfortable, has this ever happened to you? And what did you do in that situation? So what did that look like for you? I will share. This happens to me quite a lot. I work in a major city. Frequently, there's more than one survivor in a given shift, and navigating multiple survivors at once is really hard. But if this has happened to someone, or if you are this advocate, know you are not alone. First and foremost, ask for help. So can you call your admin? Can you get another advocate out? You're not alone in this work. The forensic nurse is there too. Ask for help when you need it. Work with the forensic nurse. They typically decide the order of the exam, so who gets the exam first, and use that to guide your interactions. I always say document, connect with your own administration, because your agency might have different policies, and I don't want to speak out of turn, but working with multiple survivors might warrant outreach to admin. Triage where you can. So what is important when? Thinking about those most important tasks and then prioritizing from there, breaking it down to small steps, especially if you're overwhelmed, and then thinking about explaining your own capacity to a survivor. So you would not say that there's more than one survivor in right now, but you might say, I am going to be with you in 10 minutes, in 20 minutes, giving really actionable timelines to survivors. This might sound obvious, but remaining calm and a grounding force is one of the most important parts of this job. And then taking care of yourself in this setting. I know that's easier said than done, but really prioritizing your own regulation. So navigating some of the trauma responses in the hospital can be quite challenging. So survivors, may have a variety of trauma responses. If you remember your neuro, all trauma responses are valid, and they happen automatically and instinctively as we try to survive. Some responses you might see: laughing, joking, anger, flat affect, disassociation, tears. You might see more explosive behavior, so sort of explosive anger, or really high, really low lows quite quickly. You might also see survivors struggle with boundaries. Please know that these responses are all normal. Remembering our neurobiology as a provider is especially helpful, and thinking about how to build our own skills and capacity in supporting survivors through these trauma responses. So how do we do that? I really want to hear from you all because I've been talking for a long time, but I love to hear what grounding and coping strategies folks are using in the hospital, in general. What are you all doing to help survivors ground and manage some of those more difficult responses? You are welcome to come off chat, or off mute rather, if that's helpful to you all. Feel free. I do breathing exercises for myself. the 3-3-3 method. Yeah, Sherry, that's awesome. Breathing, meditation. Thank you. Nice. So Sherry highlighted something really important. You do the exercises for yourself. Meditation, mindfulness, so whenever I'm with a survivor offering them a grounding strategy, I will do it with them always. Or I will model it and they can take what they want from it and take it home with them or use it or not. One, that right brain to right brain regulation is very powerful. When survivors see you taking deep, expansive breaths and being able to be calm and grounded, that helps them calm and ground themselves. So when you have a controlled central nervous system and you're within your window of tolerance, it helps others in the space match that. Dysregulation cannot calm down dysregulation. You've had success with distraction. Distraction's a great one, whether a story, something mildly funny, etc. Excellent. I think distraction is so undervalued, especially if folks are struggling with pain, distracting them with anecdotes. I've talked about a variety of things. I'm going to offer up some hospital grounding strategies. You might like these. You can take them away with you and use them in your work. You can use them yourself. I practice these. But I think about keeping these simple. Simple and accessible is the way to go. If you try to do a complicated visualization and a survivor is dysregulated, simply put, it will not work. You have to use an intervention that matches the survivor's activation level. So it's an accessible strategy, right? If you're talking about a visualization of a rock in a pond floating down the river and someone is abundantly dysregulated, more than likely, they might not be able to access that breath work. So I will offer survivors something to hold. Ice, something cold or hot. Playing with temperature can really help regulate the nervous system. I always carry fidgets just because I like them, but survivors also like them because there's something to hold. You'll also see that breath work that was mentioned in the chat. I do love a box breath. I think it's accessible. I will also do 2 sharp inhales and an extended exhale. So when folks are sobbing, you'll see them naturally do this, but it's a really sharp inhale, and then I lengthen my exhale. I'll offer music. I've also offered to think in categories with people. So let's name colors. Let's name movies. Let's name genres. It gives them something for their brain, their cognition to do. Their body doesn't feel super safe. So sometimes having something to cognitively engage with is helpful, or movement can help in that, in managing those cognitions. I've counted backwards. I've listed favorites. My other favorite one to do is take 5. Really simple. You just give somebody an imaginary high five. You take your pointer finger, you inhale, you trace 1 thumb, you exhale, you lower, and you do that on all 5 fingers. So not only are you having somebody take 5 deep breaths, you're also allowing them to move their body in a way that is safe and regulated. Other ones, I've seen the nostril breath. So you'll inhale, hold a nostril, exhale, flip to the other. But again, thinking about making them simple. So you'll see survivors use a variety of coping skills. You can offer them coping mechanisms. I always try to focus on emotion-focused, adaptive, and problem-focused. Survivors come to the hospital with their own lived experience, their own coping strategies. And those can be leveraged, right? When safety planning. So what's worked for you in the past? Are you willing to do that again? And if survivors are struggling to identify those coping skills, this is where you might offer some of those grounding strategies. I want to name that coping skills look different person to person. And there's some coping skills that we as individuals, might not be comfortable with, or we wouldn't recommend. So there are definitely some coping skills I will name that I, as an individual, am uncomfortable with, but I am not going to tell a survivor not to use them. So survivors who might misuse drugs or alcohol, or maybe they'll self-harm. It can be dangerous to remove coping skills without offering a feasible or accessible alternative. So, in taking away coping skills, we might put survivors at greater risk of using more dangerous or risky ones that are even less safe. We can validate feelings and skills without personally agreeing with them or signing off on them. Again, it's our opinion on it doesn't matter. It's not for us to dictate what people can or should be using to manage this very, very difficult situation. So I'm going to skip this slide because we named a lot of these, but these are some things that survivors have asked me in the past directly. And they were really difficult for me to answer. Survivors seeking advice, survivors seeking reassurance that I could not give around safety, around convictions, survivors being inappropriate with me or another provider, or seeking personal information, or they're asking about, my own experience with sexual violence. I would encourage you to think about how you're going to respond to those interactions before they happen, so that you're not surprised by them and you're able to sort of regulate your way through that. So lastly, how do you think about closing the interaction with survivors? How do you exit? How do you walk away? I always thank the survivor for allowing me to be present with them and trusting me in this process. It is, a privilege to walk with survivors through this process and being really genuine in offering that support. I will also make sure that they know the actionable follow-up plan. But really, the exit strategy can be just as difficult as the introduction. So how are you, closing it out? How are you ending the interaction? I have a very strict boundary around physical touch. I do not touch survivors I work with in an exam setting. So for me, a hug or a handshake would not be appropriate. That might look different for you, but think about how you're going to leave it with somebody. So of course, there can be difficult interactions with other service providers. I think that relationship piece is invaluable. If you would like to talk about that offline, off of this, training, I'm happy to connect with you. But I'm going to give you all an opportunity to share in the chat around your own regulation and preparation. I just threw, oh, Sean, I'm sorry, I missed your comment. For the end, it's imperative to continue to give eye contact so that you are in it from the beginning to the end. Yes, absolutely. And that they have your full attention. So I'm going to throw it back to you all. I just gave you a ton of information. How do you all prepare for doing hospital advocacy? And how do you regulate yourself in the hospital? So how are you preparing for this work? Whether that's before the shift, days before the shift, how are you regulating once you're in the hospital? What does that look like for you if you feel comfortable sharing? Making sure to drink water. Oh my goodness, Caitlin. I feel like you just read me to filth a little bit. But yes, drinking water, taking breaks is needed, receiving supervision is needed. Supervision is huge. I reset my mindset on the drive to the hospital, going in with a blank slate and no assumptions. Thank you, Megan. Yeah. Focus on the positive of helping someone. Yeah. Thinking about the asset-based piece of this interaction. Excellent. Yeah. So I want to name that, like, this can feel many types of ways for people, and this can express itself in many ways, but it can be overwhelming. Focus on the positive. Yeah. For me, you pray privately. That's lovely. Prayer meditation is such a powerful tool as well. I notice if I need a break and check in with survivors as they may need that break too. Yes, it also models the ability to advocate for yourself and honor the body. Megan, thank you for that. Compartmentalize when you can. Remember you have your own life. Remembering that you are a person with identities and interests outside of this work. Huge. When I offered all of those grounding strategies to you all, those are ones that I do in my daily life, separate and apart from this work. I also regulate myself in the hospital by doing the exercises with the survivor. Like, those exercises help me as well. So when we meet survivors in the midst of trauma, they may be in the middle of a trauma response. One of the most powerful interventions is being steady, regulated, and having your own central nervous system regulated. For me, I break things down into very small steps so that I can co-regulate, and I work on actionable things. Sometimes it's simply like, let's do one thing at a time, and I will say that. Megan also said asking for support from your team and seeing where you can share responsibilities. Yes, seek supervisor support as needed. Yoga, breath. Yes, I modeled the same grounding tools, and yes, it does help. Thanks, y'all. So preparing for advocacy before you get to the hospital. Somebody named the car ride to the hospital, and I love that. So how are you preparing to do it? Do you have your act together? Like, are you ready to do this? Do you have the information ready? Do you have your consent ready? Do you have your paperwork ready? Do you know your referrals? Like, are you as a human being prepared to do this? So for me, I have to think about, am I physically and emotionally ready to be on call? And I have to make some lifestyle changes, honestly, before I shift to be ready to take on the shift. So I think about my caffeine, my water, how much I'm eating or not eating before I shift, addressing all of those things so I'm ready to show up as the best version of myself for a survivor. I also always have things packed so that if I do get a call, I'm ready to go, I'm feeling calm, I'm feeling ready, and I don't have to worry about, like, oh, did I leave this, piece of paperwork on the table? Like, I'm confident that I have my act together and that I have everything prepared. This is a delicate and difficult job because if your head isn't right, then how can you help with someone else's? Oh, well, you are about to lead into my next slide. Thank you. So, advocates and survivors, no, that's awesome. Thank you. I'm glad our headspace is in the same spot. You're doing this work usually in an active emergency department. And those are not super calming places. If you have to walk through the emergency department with the survivor yourself, you might see things that you never thought that you would have to see. Somebody in severe physical pain or who's really, really sick. That can be traumatizing. So preparing yourself, making sure that you know how to regulate yourself in that environment. If you find yourself outside of your window of tolerance when working in the hospital, what are you going to do? Um, I always think, one, have I met my own basic needs? I cannot give care to a survivor if I am not well. Separate and apart from that and my work, I deserve to be a well human being, um, regardless of the work that I do. When I'm in the hospital, I do those breathwork exercises. Please also don't hesitate to excuse yourself. If you need to take a break, whether that's to use the restroom, grab some water, or you feel yourself being dysregulated, what I will often do is say to the survivor, is there anything I can get you? If the survivor says yes, I will say, if it's okay with you, I'm going to go walk and get that. Now, I might take the long way around so that I can walk a little bit, I can collect myself, and I can come back calm and grounded. Using things like that can be really, really helpful in your toolkit. And then also, don't be hard on yourself if you find yourself, dysregulated, or getting aroused. How do we help ourselves in regulating through that? This is my last slide, and I would really love any engagement in the chat that you feel comfortable with. But I want to close out. First and foremost, my use of language here is intentional. I really struggle with the use of language of self-care. I try and use a language of self-maintenance, but we can't self-care our way out of systemic issues. But what we can do is take the important steps that are necessary to help maintain ourselves as human beings. Working within the medical model or working within, underfunded models, this work is really important, but sometimes that work is not always valued the way that it should be. That does not mean that we should not take care of ourselves. We have to take care of ourselves to give care to survivors, but also we owe it to ourselves as human beings to take care. We have to take the steps necessary to maintain ourselves and reach out for support when that gets difficult. I want to name that this is easier said than done. This is not linear. This frequently changes for people. When I started doing advocacy work 3 years ago, my self-maintenance and self-care looked very different. It had to shift to meet the changes that I was experiencing emotionally and physically. And don't be afraid to reevaluate or change your self-care practices. So just some basic ones I would think about. Are you meeting your own basic needs? So have you eaten? Have you had water? Are you over-caffeinated? Have you slept? Have you rested? Have you given yourself time off? Now, please know, by presenting you this, I am working on this as well. So do not think that I am not also working on my self-care practices. Second question, are we giving ourselves the grace and kindness and empathy that we would give a survivor? We deserve the same grace, kindness, and empathy. Outside of meeting your bare minimum needs, what are you doing to support your own emotional, physical, mental, and spiritual well-being? If you feel comfortable sharing in the chat, what are you doing to meet those needs around your well-being, whether that is physical, emotional, spiritual? So I will share, and then I will read out the ones in the chat, just in case people don't feel comfortable. I have had to shift my self-care needs, my self-maintenance from, I used to really experience a lot of overstimulation from being in the hospital. So a lot of my self-care now is around sensory deprivation. So releasing the sort of trauma and chaos that I feel like is held in my body from being in the hospital. So I do a lot of grounding work. I do a lot of walking, and work around coming down from the experience. Megan said resting, yoga, listening to my body, eating well, making lists, prioritizing. Yep, excellent. One thing that I will say as an advocate, this work can be really isolating. Typically, it's just you and the survivor. Thinking about maybe adding in a community care piece to your self maintenance. So, not only are we working to care for ourselves, but also taking care of ourselves in community with others. Um, I would also really think about your self care plan as something non-linear, um, constantly re examining it, making sure that it's sustainable and doable for you, and recognizing that what worked for you at one point might not work for you now, and that's okay. Um, but with that, thank you all so much for coming. Alyssa popped an evaluation in the chat. Sorry, I said that oddly. You are welcome to reach out to me via email if you have questions. Please fill out the evaluation. It's helpful to me in improving our trainings. But thank you all for sharing this space with me.